How many times has civilization restarted? This haunting question has obsessed archaeologists, historians, and scientists for decades, because beneath our feet, buried under layers of sediment and time, lie the ruins of societies that once ruled the world, only to vanish, leaving barely a whisper in the records of history. Entire civilizations, along with their knowledge, their achievements, and their millions of inhabitants, wiped off the map as if they had never existed. The history we were taught in school is barely a fragment of the truth. We are told of Mesopotamia as the first civilization, of Egypt and its pyramids, of Greece and Rome. But every year, new archaeological discoveries push our origins further and further back in time. Impossible structures emerge from jungles. Sunken cities appear beneath the oceans. Technologically advanced artifacts are unearthed in strata where they simply shouldn't be. And with every find, the question becomes more urgent. How many times have we reached the heights of civilization only to fall into oblivion?
When we think of human history, we usually imagine a continuous line, a slow but steady progress leading from the first stone tools to the modern world. An orderly, coherent story where each advancement builds upon the last. But what if that line isn't real? What if history doesn't always move forward, but instead restarts time and time again? There are places in the world that don't quite fit the official narrative, constructions that seem far too precise for their era, knowledge that appears ahead of its time, and historical gaps where clear answers should be. Traces that don't align with what we think we know about our origins. Civilizations that, according to the accepted chronology, shouldn't have been capable of raising certain structures or mastering specific knowledge, yet they left behind marks that are impossible to ignore. We aren't talking about empires that slowly fell due to war or internal decay, but about cultures that vanished almost entirely, without a clear transition, without direct heirs, as if their story had come to a sudden halt. As if something had wiped the board clean. Today, we are going to look into that void. We are going to explore the possibility that human civilization wasn't born just once, but several times. That before us, there were other beginnings, other advancements, and other falls so deep they left behind barely any recognizable remains. This isn't a story of conspiracies or intentionally hidden secrets. It is a story of lost memory. And if that possibility is real, then the most unsettling question isn't how many times civilization has restarted, but whether we are living just before the next reset.
When we begin to look closely at the past, a recurring problem emerges. There are structures that simply do not fit the story we've been told. It's not just an isolated pyramid or a poorly dated ruin. The pattern repeats across different continents, in cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years, with no known contact between them. Colossal stone structures, raised with extreme precision, aligned with cardinal points or astronomical events that require prolonged observation and complex calculations. Works that, according to the official narrative, were built by societies without iron, without advanced pulleys, without functional wheels, and yet they still stand thousands of years later. The pyramids are the best known example. Egypt, Mesoamerica, South America, Asia, similar shapes, repeated proportions, and surprisingly precise orientations. It is often said that the pyramid is a simple and stable form, and that's true, but that explanation leaves out too many details. The accuracy of the angles, the near-perfect alignment with true north, and the repetition of specific mathematical and astronomical patterns. The same occurs with megalithic walls, blocks weighing dozens or even hundreds of tons, carved into irregular shapes that fit together like pieces of a three-dimensional puzzle. Joints so precise they won't even fit a single sheet of paper. No mortar, no margin for error. In places like the Andes, the Eastern Mediterranean, or Asia, we find the same construction technique attributed to cultures that, in theory, never met. The question isn't just how they moved those stones, but how they achieved that level of precision systematically. And then there is the sky. Many of these constructions aren't just built to withstand the passage of time, but to dialogue with the stars. Solstices, equinoxes, solar and stellar cycles reflected in stone. In some cases, even phenomena that only fully manifest after centuries of continuous observation. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. Either we profoundly underestimate these cultures, or we are seeing the remnants of inherited knowledge, as if someone had passed down a basic manual of architecture, astronomy, and geometry to much later civilizations without them fully understanding its origin. And if that pattern repeats time and again in such distant places, then the question stops being architectural. The real question is historical. Where did this knowledge come from, and what happened to those who originally developed it?
When we speak of ancient civilizations, we usually imagine societies in an early stage of knowledge, advancing slowly toward what we consider modern science. However, upon closer inspection of certain findings, that image begins to crack. There are objects and systems created in antiquity that are not just surprising, but seem entirely out of place in their own time. Not because they are impossible, but because they imply a level of technical and scientific understanding that, according to the official chronology, shouldn't have existed yet. One of the clearest examples is the Antikythera mechanism, an artifact found at the bottom of the sea, composed of gears of extraordinary precision, capable of predicting eclipses, planetary cycles, and complex astronomical movements. For centuries, nothing exists that is comparable to this level of mechanical engineering. It is as if a piece of a future that hadn't arrived yet appeared, and then that future was lost. And it is not an isolated case. In different parts of the world, we find evidence of advanced metallurgy, corrosion-resistant alloys, extremely precise cutting and polishing techniques, and mathematical knowledge applied with an accuracy that requires more than just trial and error. In many cases, this knowledge appears suddenly, reaches a remarkable level, and then disappears. It doesn't evolve gradually, it isn't perfected over time, it simply vanishes. This raises an uncomfortable possibility that knowledge does not always advance in a straight line, that it can emerge, reach a peak, and be lost entirely if the structure supporting it collapses. Libraries that burn, masters who die, traditions that are interrupted, and with them, centuries of accumulated understanding. When a civilization collapses, more than just cities are destroyed. The chain of transmission for knowledge is broken. And once broken, knowledge doesn't always resurface in the same way. Some ideas are rediscovered centuries later, others are lost forever. The past, then, stops being a primitive stage and becomes a fragmented territory, filled with isolated peaks of understanding separated by vast voids. Perhaps it isn't that the ancients knew more about everything. Perhaps they knew different things, and those things were lost when there was no one left capable of teaching them. If this is the case, then every out-of-place object, every forgotten technique, and every inexplicable leap in the history of knowledge is not an isolated anomaly, but a sign of something greater. A sign that human knowledge does not always accumulate. Sometimes it fades away. And when that happens, the past stops being a simple prelude to the present and becomes a reminder of how easy it is to start again from zero.
When we try to imagine the disappearance of a civilization, we usually think of wars, invasions, or slow decays that leave behind ruins, texts, and clear traces of what happened. But the natural history of the planet tells a very different story. There are events capable of erasing almost everything in a matter of days. Events that leave no time to flee, no time to preserve knowledge, and no time to transmit warnings to the future. The Earth is not a stable environment on a deep scale. Throughout its history, it has suffered abrupt climate changes, cosmic impacts, massive volcanic eruptions, and environmental alterations capable of transforming the entire planet in a very short time. When these events occur, they do not distinguish between primitive or advanced cultures. One of the most unsettling examples is the end of the last ice age, marked by an episode known as the Younger Dryas. In an extremely short period, temperatures dropped abruptly, ecosystems collapsed, and vast stretches of the planet became uninhabitable. There is evidence of global fires, mass extinctions, and climate shifts that do not fit a slow and gradual transition. If a complex civilization had existed before that event, the impact would have been devastating. Entire cities destroyed, agricultural networks wiped out, trade routes interrupted, and most importantly, the total breakdown of the transmission of knowledge. Added to this are supervolcano eruptions, capable of blanketing the sky with ash for years, blocking out sunlight and triggering global volcanic winters. A single event of this type would be enough to collapse any society dependent on agriculture, even if its technology were advanced. The oceans are not a safe haven either. Collapsing glaciers, underwater landslides, and cosmic impacts can generate mega tsunamis capable of wiping out entire coastal regions in a matter of hours. And it is no coincidence that many of the oldest known civilizations developed near the water. When the sea advances suddenly, it leaves no libraries, it leaves no archives, it leaves no warnings, only sediment. These events are not distant theories or unrepeatable anomalies. They are natural processes documented in the geological record. They have happened before, and they will happen again. The only unknown is when. And this is the key idea. You don't need to destroy all of humanity to restart civilization. It is enough to erase the centers of knowledge, the infrastructure, and the organized populations. The survivors, scattered and traumatized, do not rebuild science, they rebuild survival. If this has already happened once, or several times, then the silence of the past stops being a mystery. It becomes a consequence. The consequence of a planet that every now and then decides to start over.
If the past was erased by catastrophes capable of breaking entire civilizations, an inevitable question arises. How is it possible that traces remain, however faint they may be? Because when a culture collapses, everything doesn't disappear at once. Sometimes people survive. Small groups that escape by chance, by distance, or by simple fortune. The problem is that these survivors don't preserve a library or an educational system or a scientific network. They preserve something far more basic, fragmented memories. And over time, those memories rarely remain as history. They transform into myth. This is why it is so striking that so many cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, share similar stories of a great disaster. Stories of floods devouring entire lands, of a previous world that was destroyed, of a humanity that had to start over. They aren't exact copies, but they share the same emotional structure. Something immense happened, something was lost, and only a handful of survivors remained. The idea isn't that every myth is a literal chronicle. The idea is more unsettling, that myths might be the most resilient form of memory when everything else breaks down. When archives vanish, when texts are lost, when the specialists die, the only thing that can travel through time is what can be told around a fire. Furthermore, in some accounts, a recurring detail appears: figures who teach, gods, sages, beings coming from another time or from the sky, who provide agriculture, astronomy, writing, and laws. Perhaps they aren't gods, perhaps they are symbols, but the pattern suggests something: the idea that after the disaster, someone knew more and tried to rebuild the world with whatever was left. If we accept this possibility, then the past wasn't lost entirely. It leaked through, not in the form of books or technologies or precise records, but as stories that survived, distorted, blended, and obscured by centuries of repetition.
like a weak signal coming from a previous world that nevertheless insists on making itself heard. And that is what is so haunting. If there were restarts, perhaps we aren't facing an absolute void. Perhaps we are facing a broken memory scattered across myths, symbols, and warnings that we never knew how to read for what they might truly be.
If civilizations can vanish and memories survive only as myths, there is a key element that explains why the past becomes so dark. Knowledge is extremely fragile. You don't need to destroy entire cities to erase centuries of progress. It is enough to burn the places where that knowledge is concentrated. Libraries, study centers, archives, schools. When they disappear, a civilization doesn't just lose information, it loses the ability to remember who it once was. History is full of these episodes. The Library of Alexandria is the best-known symbol, but it wasn't an isolated case. Great centers of learning in Baghdad, Nalanda, Constantinople, or Mesoamerica were destroyed by war, fanaticism, or simple political decisions. In many cases, we don't know exactly what was lost. We only know that it never came back. The problem is that knowledge is not preserved automatically. It requires teachers, continuity, institutions, and time. When that chain is broken, even highly advanced knowledge can disappear in a single generation. What is not taught is forgotten. What is not practiced is lost. Some ancient technologies are a clear example of this. Materials we couldn't reproduce for centuries. Techniques mentioned in texts, but whose exact methods no one knows anymore. Not because they were impossible, but because the people who mastered them were gone. And here, a disturbing idea emerges. A reset doesn't need to exterminate humanity. It only needs to disorganize it enough so that knowledge stops being transmitted. Survivors can build shelters, grow food, and tell stories, but they rarely rebuild advanced science from scratch. If this has happened time and again, then the past isn't empty by accident. It is empty because it burned. And when knowledge burns, what follows is not immediate progress. It is a long return to the basics, under the illusion of starting for the very first time.
When we observe history from a distance, a pattern begins to emerge that is difficult to ignore. Civilizations do not advance in a straight line. They grow, they stabilize, they reach a peak, and then they begin to fracture. This cycle has repeated itself many times. The Maya, for example, built complex cities, precise astronomical systems, and a sophisticated social organization. And yet, within a few generations, many of their urban centers were abandoned, not due to a single cause, but through a combination of factors that collapsed all at once. Rome followed a similar path. For centuries, it was a robust, interconnected, and efficient system. But the more complex it became, the more it depended on every single part functioning without failure. When that network began to break down, economically, politically, and socially, collapse became inevitable. Something similar happened at the end of the Bronze Age. Entire civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean vanished almost at the same time. Cities burned, trade was interrupted, and writing was forgotten. For centuries, no one could fully explain what had happened. Only a void remained. The recurring lesson is clear. Complexity is a strength, but it is also a weakness. The more a society relies on specialized systems, the more vulnerable it becomes to disruptions. A single isolated failure can spread like a chain reaction. This pattern doesn't mean that collapse is immediate or identical in every case, but it does suggest something unsettling. Civilizations tend to believe their moment of stability is permanent right before they discover it isn't. If we accept this, then the past stops looking like a succession of isolated accidents. It begins to look like a recurring process, a cycle in which progress creates the conditions for its own fragility. And if that cycle has happened so many times, the question is no longer if a civilization can collapse, it becomes when. Our civilization perceives itself as the most advanced in history. Global technology, instantaneous communication, and a wealth of accumulated knowledge unlike anything seen before. And yet, we have never been so fragile. Much of what sustains the modern world depends on invisible systems that operate in silence. Constant electricity, data networks, satellites, interconnected infrastructures that we rarely think about, but upon which we completely rely. When everything works, they seem indestructible. When something fails, the effect is immediate. The difference between us and past civilizations is not just the level of technology, but the degree of dependence. Today, a prolonged power outage doesn't just mean discomfort, it means collapse. Communications that go dark, transport systems paralyzed, supply chains interrupted, knowledge rendered inaccessible. Furthermore, a large part of our collective memory is no longer written in stone or on paper. It is stored in digital formats that require constant power, maintenance, and compatibility. If those systems fail, we don't just lose buildings, we lose information. And information is the invisible skeleton of our civilization. Added to this are threats beyond our control. Solar storms capable of damaging satellites and power grids, shifts in the Earth's magnetic field, an extreme reliance on global supply chains, a world where almost no one knows how to manufacture from scratch the things they use every day. The paradox is clear. The more advanced a civilization becomes, the more it depends on everything functioning at once. And the more interconnected the system is, the less margin there is for error. This is not an apocalyptic prediction. It is an historical observation. Every civilization that believed itself to be stable did so right before discovering its own cracks. And if the past teaches us anything, it is that fragility often goes unnoticed until it is far too late.
At this point, the question arises almost on its own. If the past shows a pattern of rises and collapses, if knowledge can be lost, and if our civilization is as interconnected as it is fragile, then it's only natural to wonder if we are truly safe from history repeating itself. It isn't about announcing a specific catastrophe or pointing to a date. History rarely works that way. Collapses don't give clear warnings. They brew in silence, accumulating through small tensions that seem manageable until they are not. The past shows us that major changes rarely stem from a single cause. They are usually the result of several factors acting at once: environmental pressure, social instability, technological dependence, and a loss of resilience. When they coincide, the entire system becomes vulnerable. Our era is no different. We live in a world that is extraordinarily complex, efficient, and globalized, but also one where a serious disruption can spread with unprecedented speed. And when everything depends on everything else, the room for reaction shrinks drastically. If an event occurred tomorrow capable of breaking that network, not necessarily the end of humanity, but the collapse of its structures, the question wouldn't be how many people would survive, but what would remain of who we are. What knowledge would manage to be passed on? What fragments of today's world would reach the future, distorted and fragmented? Perhaps thousands of years from now, someone will find the scattered remains of our civilization and ask themselves the same question we are asking today. Perhaps they will see anomalies, silences, and incomplete technologies, wondering how it was possible for everything to disappear so quickly. That possibility isn't a certainty, but it isn't impossible either. And by simply raising the question, the past stops being a curiosity and becomes a warning. When we observe the past from this perspective, history stops being a simple succession of dates and names. It becomes something more unsettling, an incomplete record full of interruptions, silences, and beginnings that we do not remember.
Perhaps we are not the first human civilization to reach a certain level of complexity. Perhaps before us there were other attempts, other advancements, other societies that believed they had overcome all limits, and yet they vanished. If that is true, then the real problem isn't the collapse itself, it is the forgetting. Each restart doesn't just destroy cities and technologies, it destroys memory. It breaks the continuity of knowledge and forces us to start over, unaware that the path has been traveled before. And here, a fundamental idea emerges. Perhaps we cannot avoid every collapse. The Earth will change, the climate will shift, and nature will remain unpredictable. But there is something that can mark the difference between a simple reset and continuity: remembering. Remembering not as nostalgia, but as understanding. Studying the past not to idealize it, but to recognize patterns. Understanding that progress is not inevitable and that stability is never guaranteed. Perhaps the greatest legacy a civilization can leave behind is not its technology or its monuments, but its ability to transmit knowledge in a resilient way, beyond a single generation, beyond a single era. Because if there ever were other human worlds before our own, and if there ever were other restarts, then the most important question isn't how many times it happened, but whether, this time, we will be able to remember it. This was Impossible Horizon, and today you haven't looked at the past searching for certainties, but trying to understand a question that remains open.